Okay, so when the clock starts ticking, knowing when child find obligations begin, and we have a couple of really incredible speakers today. So if you go to the next slide, our two presenters today are Alina Rediger Lincoln. She's from AIR and is a senior TA consultant. And we have the Tessie Bailey, who's also at AIR, and she's director of the Progress Center, who's hosting this wonderful webinar today. And don't forget, all of this information is going to be amazing today. But remember, we do not provide legal advice and we cannot respond as an attorney to due process complaints or any other legal advice, whether it's related to any formal or informal complaints or sets of facts. Remember that all services and supports provided by AIR are provided as general information purposes and as technical assistance and helping you understand about the implementation of state and federal special education requirements so that you can achieve compliant systems and improve student outcomes. That was my big moment to read that disclaimer to you. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's head on to what we're really here for today. We have an exciting session. The agenda is packed full. We're going to start with staying grounded and what that child find law requires. Then we're going to go into hotspots, recognizing those child find triggers, which I'm so excited to hear about. Then we're going to take that leadership lens. We saw several of you are leaders, which is exciting. So what does that mean for you? Child find exercise for the leaders. And then obviously, after we look at hotspots, we're going to keep it cool. We're going to use data and procedures, how we can leverage data and procedures. And then we're going to close out, tell you about some more opportunities to engage with us through a few more of these series and have some reflections and takeaways. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn this over to Tessie to get us started on the insane, wonderful content that we're about to engage in today. So Tessie, go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm not sure if I can follow your energy, but I will try. So, as Sarah mentioned, I'm the director of the Progress Center, and part of our role is to support local education agencies and state departments of ed implement IDEA requirements. We've had a lot of questions around child fine and trying to understand like when a concern becomes a responsibility, like when do we need to act? So we're going to share a couple things I'd like you to reflect on because we'll come at the end of this session, we'll come back to these scenarios and really talk about what should have happened. So imagine, and I'm sure you've had this before, a parent walks into one of your district buildings for enrollment next week and verbally mentions to you that their child is struggling. This could also be a teacher, anybody who comes in and says, you know what, my kid is really struggling and I hope they can get some help. Or what about a parent raises maybe some informal concerns about, their child's having some increasing anxiety, and that they're just not, really performing like they would expect to be. And they sent this through an email now, right? So the first one, we've really got it. They verbally mentioned it. Now we have an email that comes to a teacher. And then we, on our own data, start to see that a student is showing that inconsistent academic performance, likely through our multi-tiered systems of support in both math and reading in the first semester. We've tried some tier 2 interventions, and they were initiated, they were delivered with fidelity, but we're just not seeing the progress we would expect to see. And these are things that happen to school leaders and teachers almost every day. And the question is, when do we need to act? When does child find sort of, come into play, and us as an LEA have a responsibility to do this? And somebody mentioned, states give districts far too much leeway in how fast they can respond. So thanks for sharing that. So I'm going to pass this over to Alina, who's really going to walk us through when do we act and what are the things that we need to consider.
Thank you, Tessie. And yes, I'm excited to be here as well. I'm going to try to mirror a little bit of Sarah's energy, get this discussion moving forward. Kind of thinking about staying grounded, what the child find law requires. That's the first spot. Figuring out what is the law so that you can recognize those signs and indicators of when you need to act. Before we get started, just a real quick poll, just so I can see a little bit more about who's here. What's your current role We might have a variety of roles represented today, and there's a lot of different roles that are engaged in child find within any given system, but just kind of trying to take a shot at what's your current role. Give you a little time for a few more folks to respond. Okay, I think we can go ahead and see these responses.
I'm not seeing the
I
responses
don't see
come
responses.
through.
I don't see the responses. Well, let's see here. We're gonna I'll have Kat assist me with the technical. See, Kat, see how helpful she is already on this webinar. Help me with looking at that. But I'm going to imagine that there's some varied levels of role, maybe building level administration, district level administration, coordinators, special education directors. There's various types of positions and roles involved in ensuring that child find and their child find duties are implemented within your system. And so I appreciate you being on today, and just kind of want to say to think about this content from your perspective, and thinking about how you're going to apply some systems and some practices at the end of this webinar that will help make sure all the staff and all the folks in the system are prepared for this. Okay. First, kind of starting with the regulations, right? So IDA Part B, child find requirement. It says states must have in effect policies and procedures to ensure all children with disabilities in the state are who are in need of special and related services are identified, located, evaluated. The need to have a practical method for developing and implementing basically systems or an approach for being able to identify and determine which children are currently receiving special ed and related services. So this regulatory requirement is pretty straightforward. It's saying you're going to need to find these children with disabilities in your system and ensure that they are evaluated in a timely fashion. So let's break it down a little bit more. And I'm sorry, I think I'm missing chat. So you guys let me know if I need to look at something in there.
Well, we'll keep you posted.
Okay,
There's
yeah.
some great conversation going on, but yeah, we will
Nice.
keep you posted.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's break it down into some of the elements of that child find responsibility. First off, it is a what we call an affirmative duty. So an affirmative duty means it's your duty to act as an local educational agency. It is not, for instance, the responsibility of parents to request or children to make themselves known. It's also, you don't already have to know. It's a reasonable suspicion. There's a reason to suspect. So the duty to evaluate is triggered if the district suspects or has reason to suspect that a child has a disability and the child is in need of special ed and related services as a result. You'll see kind of that bullet in between there, all children, just a note, it includes all children, regardless of the severity of the disability. There are no uneducable children with disabilities. Those who are homeless, attend a private school, mobile, migrant, even if they're advancing from grade to grade. And so it's a very, the scope of child find in terms of all children is substantial, and it really turns on this reason to suspect. One of the reasons why child find responsibility is so important to understand and have systems for implementing and ensuring it's happening is that the consequences of failure can be significant when you are unable are not effective in finding a child with a disability who's in need of special and related services, it could result in a denial of FAPE and compensatory services from the time when you should have suspected the disability. So it's going to go back to when you should have suspected that disability, and those gaps and that ability to that inability to have served the child during that time period can result in compensatory services. So Child Find is an important first step to providing FAPE to children with disabilities. Today, we're really going to focus on that reason to suspect, that initial trigger for Child Find. There are a lot of details regarding notice, consent, evaluation timelines, and evaluation procedures that tend to roll in under Child Find. We're focused today on those factors that drive that suspicion of a disability and drive that initial decision point for you on whether to refer. Okay, so the legal standard for Child Find claims. Courts generally evaluate Child Find claims under two inquiries: whether the district had a reason to suspect a disability based on the totality of the information known at the time, and whether the district acted reasonably in light of those facts. A lot of acted reasonably, reasonable time to evaluate, a reasonable time to respond. So those reasonable factors are just built in. Your state may have laws or requirements that provide some more specific timelines or things like that. But the general rule is to respond in a reasonable time once you have a reason to suspect a disability based on all the information known at the time. So let's think a little bit more about what are some of those factors that drive the reasonable suspicion. We're talking about this as hotspots, recognizing Child Find triggers. There's going to be quite a few, right? There's a lot of different buckets of data and information that you would need to keep an eye on within your system. There could be things from parent requests, parents' repeated concerns, intervention, limited response despite intervention data, behavior, screening, progress monitoring patterns, outside evaluations, even transfer records. Sometimes people don't think about that, but as students transfer in, what is that telling you? There are also some times you're going to watch attendance. You're going to need to think about health issues and medical concerns. There's lots of categories of information that we want to be able to think about when we think about, do you have a reason to suspect that a child has a disability and needs special ed? So let's walk through it.
Can I chime in real quick? Because I was sharing in here is, as people think about this reason to suspect, I want to remind folks that, IDA looks at academic and functional needs, and we often focus on students struggling in academics. But if you look at categories, for example, like autism or other health impairment, as you're mentioning, the need for special education, or the thing that may be associated with the need, is a functional behavior rather than academic. So as you're going through these, I just wanted to orient folks that we're not just looking at those academic concerns. We're looking at anything that may prevent the kid, because of the disability, from being successful, which could be social, emotional, executive functioning, or other sort of functional behaviors.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think that's a really great point, Tessie. There's an adverse, when you think about a disability category and whether or not a child has a disability, we know from the definitions that there's a requirement that it has an adverse effect on educational performance. But that performance is not limited to academics. It's also functional and access to that educational environment and the curriculum and such. So I think that's a really good point. We will walk through several different kind of categories of information, but you're right. Don't have over fixated on one particular content area or one particular category of data. So when we are starting with academic performance patterns, however, but that's, as you just said, it's not the only factor to look at, but courts do look at failing, declining grades. You may have benchmark assessment data that shows some significant, some data that shows a student is significantly below expectations. There are other academic performance measures. Some things that are kind of tricky about this is there is no bright line rule on any of these Child Find factors. It's a multi-factored evaluation, and so you have to consider multiple types of data, and typically one particular factor alone is not going to be enough to trigger child find. It's a combination of converging factors. You see here that poor grades alone, student might be getting poor grades alone, not enough to trigger a child find. But when you compound that with other factors, maybe there's some medical information, or there's some absenteeism or different factors, that's when you start to think about the poor grades are kind of contextualized and potentially indicating a disability. But also know, as we know from the actual the regulations themselves, passing from grade to grade and passing grades do not defeat a child find. Just because a student is getting passing grades doesn't mean that the student may not need to be evaluated if other warning signs exist. So I think my main takeaway when we think about the academic performance patterns is that consider multiple measures of academic performance and really make sure you're noting those compounding factors. What other factors are at play for this student? So it's usually some combination that might trigger a need to act. Okay, another area that typically comes up is behavioral and emotional indicators. Courts give weight to persistent behavioral problems, mental health concerns, disciplinary incidents, escalating conduct issues. And so really do need to treat behavioral red flags as strong triggers, particularly when they persist despite gen ed interventions or some kind of intervention system, or are exceptionally severe. So ask yourself, are there persistent or severe behavioral problems at play? So just some initial behavioral concerns that may be explained from other reasons, or something that you want to apply some general ed interventions and such for, that's perfectly fine. But when you see them escalating, you see it persisting over a significant period of time, or there's a level of severity that requires a look, don't overlook those behavioral issues. Okay, I've been to sessions where people kind of talk about prescription pad diagnoses and these outside evaluations or medical diagnoses that you may receive in your system from parents and others. The key factor is to really look at whether the district had knowledge of medical diagnoses, private evaluations, reports from outside providers, or potentially knowledge of like repeated hospitalizations. There's examples of that. They've really focused on what you knew, not what existed in the abstract. And so you do need to think about who's receiving some of this information. What do we know as a system? Even though you might know it not know it as a leader, who's receiving some of this outside information or medical related information, and making sure you're staying on top of it. A tip might be to assign responsibility for who's logging and reviewing outside reports that come in. Kind of conduct a record request, who's looking at enrollment and transfer information so that we're aware of these factors. So the question for this category is, are there known medical conditions or outside evaluations the district needs to consider?
Elena, I would just say the person who often receives this information is the classroom teacher. So, the general education classroom teacher, and they may say, oh, that's interesting, but not really understand that it could potentially be a trigger. So as a leader, how are you building your educators' capacity to understand what should, maybe they don't make the decision, but at least it gets moved over to somebody to review that information.
Right. Yeah, I think that, and later on today, we'll talk about some different ways you might be able to have procedures or some resources and tools for staff. And one of the categories, or one of the thinking is, you really need to think about who is typically receiving some of these types of data, some of these categories of information, and making sure that you're thinking about, do they know what their responsibilities are? What do they do with it? How do they pass it along? How do they know how to escalate it if needed? So I think that's a really good point. It also comes up with parent input and requests. So that kind of, I think your point, Tessie, leads in a little bit to this category, which is that parent concerns or complaints, particularly explicit requests for evaluation, and just repeated communications about struggles, those are also a factor courts look at. When you have repeated parental concerns, it can support, as a factor, could support a child find violation if they're ignored. So the more repeated or specific types of concerns you're receiving from parents, the stronger that trigger evidence might be. So parent concerns might come to multiple people. They do often come to the child classroom teacher of the child. They might come in at parent-teacher conferences, but they might also, like our scenario at the beginning, they might just be that, hey, you're at a school function and a parent comes and talks to you. You're the principal, you're the superintendent, and so being able to really make sure we're considering the cumulative record of parent concerns and requests when we're thinking about a child is important. So some type of standard intake and routing procedures. So when parents request share parent concerns, or especially if they request an evaluation, you want to have a standard intake procedure so that staff at the building level, other staff that might receive those, even office staff, know what to do with those requests. When we talk about parent requests, just real quick, just so you know that parent request for an evaluation does require more formal response. And so, like I said earlier, we're really talking about what are the triggers that cause the obligation of the district to act. When a parent requests an evaluation, you have to respond within a reasonable time in a formal manner with prior written notice, either to propose the evaluation or refuse the evaluation. There is also a note that parents don't have to use magic language. They don't have to specifically say, I'm requesting a comprehensive special education evaluation for my child because I think they might be eligible under IDEA. It may not be enough to just say, hey, let's do some testing if it's not associated with this idea of, I think my child might have a disability and needs special ed. But just keep in mind, there's no magic language. You need to think about, what is this parent really asking for, given what I'm hearing and what I know is going on, and then make sure we're ready to escalate those that are actual requests for an eval.
Yeah, and I think what sometimes happens is a parent doesn't associate it with a disability, like you're saying. They just see that their kid is struggling, and it really is upon the district to say, I suspect that it may be the result of a disability. The parent doesn't have to suspect that.
That's right. Yeah, parent requests can come in different ways. That parent input and concerns is one of those data points the district has to use in order to make sure they're really implementing their child find responsibility. And then if a parent is requesting it, we'll talk about data later, but one of the data points I liked to collect when I was a local director is to really look at how many of our evaluations were triggered by a parent's request. We were responding to a parent request. To me, if I have a high number of parent requests for eval that we respond to and evaluate, then that says something about whether I'm really implementing my affirmative duty. We're supposed to find these kids. We're not supposed to have parents have to ask us for it.
So we have a question that I think is directly related to this, and it's like, what happens if you get a request that comes in the summer for an incoming kindergarten student, given timelines?
That's a great question. Different states may have worked timeline requirements differently in their state laws. For instance, in one state I know and live in, the timeline is based on school days. So your requirement to evaluate is based on a school day in that state. If it is not limited to school days and you potentially have approximately 60 calendar days, you're going to need a system for receiving those requests and implementing that evaluation outside of the school year. So it is important, I think, to kind of know your state law on the timeline and making sure that you respond to the parent's request within a reasonable time. So you want to have time to consider the data, meet as a team, and think about how you're going to respond to get that prior written notice out there. And then if it does require a special ed evaluation, even though it's summer, if your timeline is 60 calendar days, you're going to need a system for being able to work through those evaluations.
Yeah, and I think somebody mentioned it's 60 school days from the receiving the signed consent. So yeah, definitely check with your state law.
Yeah, definitely check with your state law. And because I'm in a state with that requirement, I like to tell people it is helpful. It makes sense because you need your team available. I mean, the process itself requires staff and possibly observations. Lots of things are harder to do in the summertime. However, do keep in mind 60 school days feels like a lot. It can feel like a lot longer time to a parent and a child. So just kind of thinking about that. When you're implementing that time frame and making sure you're implementing it as soon as you can and staying within that time frame. Okay, we also have that category of teacher observation. So teachers can make referrals, teachers share data, teachers are meeting and thinking about students and gathering a variety of data points all the time. So they're a very important source of information and red flags or triggers for child find. They also may be implementing interventions for your system and having that intervention data and looking at that data and analyzing it. So really thinking about how am I gathering and how do people know how to respond and what to do with teacher reports of learning or behavioral issues, intervention data, particularly if the response is limited, and verifying that there's appropriate intervention selection, matched to the child. What are those procedures for being able to take that data and determine, is there a pattern is there data here that suggests a disability? Do we know how to escalate this process effectively? The key to me is, I think, making sure it's making sure you're not continuing ineffective support. So if districts have documented database rationale for your decisions and you're following escalation procedures, you're often not going to find some kind of a child find trigger based on like a response to intervention process and that intervention data. But if you have intervention data that is limited and it's persistent, and escalation, and it appears you're continuing ineffective supports, it can definitely be a trigger for a child find violation. So the question for you to think about is, did the district monitor and document interventions and adjust supports, or consider when that referral, when interventions were not effective?
And one thing I want to point out here, because we
Mhm.
have seen this in policies in some states, is that a student may be responding, but the nature of the services necessary for that response to occur look like special education, and the school suspects. So I think there's often this assumption they have to fail, right? That's why we're trying to get
Yep.
rid of the wait to fail. But you could have data that in order for the student to be able to progress, they maintain that progress, they need specially designed instruction. And we suspect that that need is the result of the impact of the disability. So I think it's important to think about that if you're using RTI, particularly for SLD eligibility, how are your educators making those decisions?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, defining one of the tips is generally, having escalation procedures, defining in advance how many review cycles, discussion, and making sure you do also know your state law in this category is also really important. All right, let's talk also about attendance and context. Some of these factors, I think of them as just just a factor that you would need to consider, but they can be viewed as limiting factors. So for instance, there might be data that you have that provides an alternate explanation to the situation. So if a student may have some poor academic performance data, but you have also understand that there's been a lack of instruction or there's absenteeism that is likely the factor for that poor performance. So these alternative explanations are important to still bring into the fold and be thinking about. I also think, though, that you, just like any other factor, if you have absenteeism and poor grades alone, might not trigger child find. But if you have absenteeism and you have some knowledge or some other data point that suspects that there might be an actual disability that could be contributing to the absenteeism, now you're in that convergence of factors, and you would need to think about referring for an evaluation. So if the difficulties are explained by non-disability factors, courts might not find a trigger, right? It's, do you suspect that child has a disability and needs special ed? So you want to ask yourself, are the student's absences connected to any known behavioral, medical, or psychological conditions? I think tracking absences is an important component, and then thinking about those absences, like, the why of that. And if it's connected to some type of a potential disability, now you've got a potential reason to refer.
And I would cautious LEAs here, because a
Mhm.
lot of folks often say they just don't want to come, or, it's like low expectation issue. And I would really challenge your staff to say, have we been able to confirm that that's the case? But just saying they don't want to come to school may not be sufficient, because I think some of the recent, especially in secondary cases, have demonstrated it may have looked like they didn't want to come to school, but there was an underlying anxiety or behavioral component that was disability related, preventing them from coming.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tessie. And I think that that is why I think that the absences trigger, maybe it's not an immediate duty to child find to evaluate, but it probably triggers a duty to check into it, right? And to learn more and make sure that there's not something going on that's related to that, to a disability that you need to follow up on. And most of you are following up on absenteeism, regardless of whether it's a contributing factor to child find, and really looking at that data points these days. But just thinking about that and making sure if it's connected to a disability indicator, that you would need to think about that in your child find responsibilities. Okay, so then kind of layering over these is this idea of duration, persistence, and escalation. So courts often find violations where there's an accumulation of warning signs over time. So they're accumulating over time and there hasn't been a referral. There's some point in there where a reasonable suspicion arose and you didn't refer. So that unreasonable delay between the accumulation of these warning signs, this data, this suspicion, and when you actually refer for an evaluation or seek an evaluation. So you're going to want to think about, regardless of the category of any of these factors, were the concerns isolated or were they persistent? Is it worsening over time? And then making sure that there wasn't delay after a clear escalation. So once you do suspect, you've got to move without delay or without, in a reasonable speed to initiate that evaluation. So all of this wraps into what I kind of a totality of the circumstances analysis. So there's these 5 factors that you could kind of maybe think through. You've got some data coming in, or there's a red flags popping, and you're thinking, okay, what do we know? And then were the students' difficulties indicative of possible disability, or are they better explained by other causes? How clear are the signs? Is it ambiguous? Do we need more information? Is it, hindsight is a little different. It's like, as of what we know right now, is it clear? And then that accumulation and persistence, is it persisting, intensifying, or multiplying over time? If those 4 things are coming together to saying we should refer, then you have to make sure your reasonable action. Did the district act promptly, or were you delaying despite that mounting evidence? Okay, and I kind of have a suggested rule. I would think anytime there's more than a couple categories of indicators over a sustained period of time, that aren't better explained by some other factor, you really probably need to move ahead. There are times where a district might have some database rationale for not moving forward. You would need to have that documented and clear, saying, despite this, here's why we don't think it's needed. Really make sure that you've got a rationale and data to support your decision to not move forward once you start getting a convergence of some of these indicators. Okay, so we're going to very quickly, talk through kind of the leadership lens, some exercises for you as leaders. And the way I think about this tends to be in what I think of as like we call it issue spotting in legal work. So I saw the signs. Maybe that's a little bit of an indicator of my age here, but I saw the signs, came to mind. You're looking for signs and patterns and issue spotting. The best way to issue spot is to be familiar with what are those factors courts look at. What's the rule? Do I have a reason to suspect the child has a disability and needs special ed? And if yes, I need to move forward in a reasonable time. So we're going to issue spot real quickly together. Here's the scenario. 3rd grade students showed inconsistent academic performance in math and reading during the first semester. Tier 2 interventions were initiated in November. In January, parent informs the teacher that there are some concerns about emotional distress, and they've made an appointment with their local mental health provider. We just want you to think about what are some potential triggers based on what we just talked about that you see. Should be an open-ended poll, which may be a problem for me seeing the results, we'll see, but try to put in what are some of those fact patterns or data points, that potential triggers that you see in this scenario. And then
Sarah's
after
going
you
to
do
share
that,
the results, so you'll
okay,
be
Here
able to
with,
see
yeah.
this.
okay, great. And then think about what information you would gather next. Just like with parents, there's no magic language. You could just say, like, inconsistent academic performance, or I'm seeing, it's been um, limited intervention progress, things like that. Whatever your thoughts are on what you're seeing as some of those triggers. We still have some people entering, so wait just a few more seconds. Okay. Did you say Sarah's going to share? I think people are still responding. If you haven't had a chance to respond in the poll, just jot it down for yourself. However, this is kind of the goal is kind of having you think about how to analyze it and what to spot, not necessarily the answer itself. So let's see what folks have said.
Inconsistent academic performance, continued struggle, inconsistent performance, stress, academic performance, and that possible health psychological needs. Parents have
Absolutely.
concerns about emotional distress. And then those are the potential triggers. You ready for what information?
Yeah,
There's
I
some
think that's
great
perfect. You all were
suggestions.
spot on, because I also saw inconsistent performance, parent concerns, potential mental health needs. All right,
So
great
some of the,
suggestions. What about what you would do
yeah,
look for next?
follow up with the parent after the mental health appointment. Look at all existing
Mhm.
scores, do progress checks. About other possible causes of stress like family factors, review the progress monitoring data and the results of tier 2 interventions. Speak with the parent about any changes in the household. Has the student mentioned any issues of bullying? Has their living situation changed? What's driving the emotional distress? Get some more teacher classroom information. And another shout out for progress in what their progress monitoring is in the tier 2 interventions. I think they nailed it.
Nice. Totally nailed it. Absolutely. So a lot of times the thing is, it's the child find issues aren't necessarily kind of one single incident or situation. It's a cumulative effect. And so by responding to these initial indicators, it's not necessarily a referral. I think there's a couple factors going on, 2 to 3, that indicate a need to maybe check more and investigate more, not necessarily a referral. And then all that data and all that other information that follow up is part of how you avoid this kind of cumulative effect getting missed. You're going to be able to go in and explore and determine whether or not there's more going on, or maybe it's explained by something other than a disability. So I thought that was really great. Thanks everyone for doing that. And we're going to go ahead and go through. Um, we're going to go through. I saw the signs part 2 is really just saying, now, if you got more information, let's say you got some of that information that the grades have slipped, but they're still passing, tier 2 intervention data progress is limited. Parent emailed the teacher and said she wanted to know the student's receiving counseling. So with these additional information, are you thinking, kind of the question for you in terms of the poll is, if you had this information, do you think you'd think you have a reason to suspect a disability and refer?
I'm going to just encourage folks to use the chat
Yeah,
box
chat would be
since
great.
it's open. It's probably a little bit easier given the open-ended response, and so then we
Yeah,
can see what you're posting.
perfect.
So what should the team document or do now? And I see some folks are writing in the chat or in the poll too. So Kat, you can share that.
Yes. Yeah, we've got the majority of saying yes. I think this is probably a yes also. We've got multiple factors at play that have been fairly persistent over time. Parent concerns, which courts consider. You've got the outside diagnoses. There might be a but to this, which would be if the team really has a database rationale for continuing or implementing some type of specific interventions now that they know more. That might be the but to my yes. But yeah, those converging factors make it seem like this might be a situation where you would want to move forward. But nothing is black and white in these. It's less about the answer and maybe more about just feeling like you have confidence in what kind of factors you consider and how to make a decision to move forward. Okay, so I'm going to move us forward also. So some of the strategies for being able to implement procedures, use data in your system to catch these child find situations. Just real quick, some data elements that I think, kind of outline some data points for your teams: intervention, grades, benchmark, attendance, behavior, health information, parent concerns, screening their C2B. You have that level that you've got to be thinking about. Really, for you, it's how am I gathering, monitoring, responding to that data throughout the year? And I think an issue is really about when some data points are isolated. So making sure someone is seeing the whole picture. How are you seeing the whole picture for kids, and keeping these different data elements in the forefront? So think about what data practices you have in place to ensure you're seeing those patterns and you have the full context of this data for kids. Another point is written procedures. They're very important. Having written procedures, they are practical tools that guide staff, support consistent implementation. Given my background with English and law, I do like some nice, heavy word procedures, lots of text. But the practical side of implementing those procedures might be to create some tools, charts, diagrams, things that really help those procedures be something that teams can implement more easily in your system. So you might have that written guidance document, but you need to make sure you're incorporating charts and graphic organizers and such to make sure that the expectations are clear and there's some practical tools for the teams to be able to implement. So this chart is one I mentioned before when Tessie had brought up, like, different people might get different data points. You think about, here's these buckets of information. Who tends to receive that information? If they get it, what should they do immediately? Okay, and what should they document? And then just to give them an idea of, like, what's kind of a pitfall to avoid. So some type of a simple chart like this one, I've got 2 pages really for it, with these different data elements might be a good way to provide that guidance to your team in a way that feels more practical to implement. But written procedures are key.
Yeah, and something I'll just remind, LEAs, you do your general supervision review that comes in from the state, and these are the things that the state is looking for when it's monitoring. Do you have these written procedures in place? And then they're also looking for evidence of the extent to which, as Elena mentioned, those procedures were actually implemented as documented. So it's just a way to make sure that you're choosing procedures that can be feasibly implemented and documented.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of implementation gap things. You've got to have the procedures there. People have to be able to absorb it and implement it. And then another reason for that data elements and those procedures is because you really want to build a defensible decision-making process. You need the data, you need the procedures, and then you create these guardrails and decision making procedures for staff so they can think, and your team, so you can think through what are the referral pathways, how do referrals get made, what documentation should I do, how do we ensure regular review of students that are not responding, and within those types of rules, what are the escalation, how do I know when to move this up a chain or add a layer of response. So making sure there's that shared understanding of who acts when concerns persist. So another, besides a chart, maybe some type of a decision tree and decision-making process can be really helpful to teams in order to implement these child find requirements. And then they kind of say, like, if it's not documented, it's hard to prove it, right? So there is a lot to documenting and making sure that you have a documented, visible path of how things worked for a student. One of the options might be, even when you're dealing with a scenario, is to almost timeline it out. Like, what do I need to chart? I need to know when concerns came in, when we tried interventions, was there progress or not? All the communication points. At what point did we refer, consent, evaluation, eligibility? When you get toward the end of that, you tend to document well. Consent, we're sending out a prior written notice. We know how to log those pieces. It's those concerns and that cumulative effect of all the data and information the school teams are accumulating over time that it becomes difficult to document and channel to the right process. So thinking about how are those going to be documented and make sure that they're visible in your system. Okay. So we're thinking, closing out, we want to just very quickly, I'm going to revisit a few of those concerns, those scenarios that Tessie had talked about when she opened us up today. Those are the concerns there. We're just going to look back at them. I'm going to add a couple data points, and you can just put this in the chat. It's really just for you, a few more examples of how to think about, now that we know what we know about the different triggers and factors to consider, converging data points, that cumulative effect over time, thinking about these patterns, and you're asking yourself, what level of risk am I talking about? Is this a high child find risk? Is this a reason to refer? Is there some concern, but I'm going to gather more data or do something different? Or is it really low or no action needed at this time? So I'm just going to give you just a moment, reflect on these. You can put your comments in the chat. And just remember, there isn't real black and white on these scenarios, right? So you're dealing with situations, every situation, every child is different. So you're taking these general rules and those factors to be considered, and you're applying them to that situation, trying to make a good professional judgment and decision. So for instance, pattern 1, you get a compounding factor of you now have an outside medical report and a medical health need. And you've also went and got some data and realized that there's some discipline issues with the student. So now that fact pattern changes a bit. May not still be a level of referral, but there's definitely some mid-level concern here to follow up on. The other pattern, that parent that raised ongoing kind of informal concerns about anxiety. There's more to it, the story. They were shared by email before break at a parent-teacher conference. So that cumulative effect of parent concern, teachers reporting, however, that the grades are A's, student met benchmarks. You've got some conflicting issues where parent has concerns, grades and discipline aren't showing an issue. So think about, how would I respond in that situation? Do I have enough to trigger referral? And then our third pattern, January, you find out the student has been showing inconsistent academic performance. You've been doing initial interventions. The parent has said, now we've got some additional factors with emotional distress, and the grades have slipped. Tier 2 intervention data showing limited progress. To me, this is probably the most clearly high risk and kind of a time to suspect a disability and refer a student. These types of patterns and situations really are just examples, all kinds of examples that you all experience. Child find liability really turns on whether, based on the totality of the information you have, do you have a reason to suspect a disability and a need for evaluation, a need for special education, and then do you respond to that? So not every struggling student must be referred, but you can't ignore converging indicators of disability. And then once that suspicion, it's reasonable to suspect, you need to act upon it. Some of the ways you can keep yourself out of hot water is really keeping in mind that it's affirmative duty, it's your responsibility. These are some of the factors of when delay becomes a problem, and then implement those data, the procedures, the decision rules, and the documentation so that your system has those elements set up and it's kind of designed to ensure child find is happening. Those are the key takeaways. I think at this point, I'm passing it on back to Sarah to close us out, or if there were questions or anything that I need to respond to from the chat, you guys let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elena and Tessie Bailey. We so appreciate this. Guys, I wish there was like a clapping feature on the webinar. This was awesome. I learned so much. And that probably shouldn't be what I said as a former special ed director. So thank you. You cannot miss our next session. Invite your friends, invite your family, invite your colleagues. This next session is taking place on August 19th. I know it's a tough time, but boy, do I have a feeling that we're all going to be facing this. We're really talking about the gaps between when you have an IEP in place, and so what it requires and what a student actually receives. So we're talking about the complications of staffing shortages, those vague service languages, you name it for a reason. A teacher might miss school, and we hopefully will be able to cover some of how that creates legal exposure and really kind of some of the systems around how we mitigate that. So I'm going to put a link to the registration in the chat. Tell everybody you know about that one. A few other just final notes as we're closing out. We are from the Progress Center. The Progress Center, I was kind of trying to comb some of the resources, and I felt like I was like bombarding people with too many resources because I think I could have put every single one in. So definitely take a look at some of the resources on the Progress site. They're amazing, and they really help a lot of people through the high quality IEPs. And if you're like, this was awesome, come talk to me about my individual problem, we have a request for support. If you just hit that QR code, we can get you hooked up with the things that you need, whatever you need. We're here to help support. If you go to the next slide, staying connected with the Progress Center is great. I think the Progress Center does one of the better jobs of just reaching out, getting you the newest information. They have an awesome YouTube channel with just these really great stories from the field. But also our newsletter is amazing. We don't send you too much. We send you just the right amount, and you can hear of other opportunities like the one you engaged with today. And finally, I want to get some feedback from you guys. So thank you so much for showing up today. And we would love if you could complete this brief survey to give us feedback. We thought this was awesome to do in the summer. It's been a hot summer, and these are some pretty cool topics. But we would want your feedback on this as well, if this is something you're interested in furthering engaging in, even past this hot summer. So leave us some feedback on that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Alina or Tessie or myself or the Progress Center, and we'd love to help you out and help get you right to the right place. And with that, I'll let you fill out your survey and give you 4 whole minutes back in your very busy, wonderful days. And we so appreciate you for showing up today and so appreciate our expert speakers. And we'll see you on the next one.